Hello everyone, today we talk once again about the Roman Empire during the Middle Ages. I couldn't find another terminology to avoid the term Byzantine, which, however, as you know, I use myself, and I want naturally to expand on, especially in this video, as today I just randomly picked one of those manualistic topics, and I realized I had already discussed the a bit historiographical question of what is Byzantine, right, and whether it exists or whether it's wrong and so on. In that other video, was actually a pretty long one. It lasted like 2 hours and a half, and I was expressing most of these concepts in perspective. I went far actually, because as I used to do, I digressed a lot, because I think the topic is very broad and it doesn't stop to the formalistic, even if you want the legalistic, which is exactly the same question in part. The idea of the Roman Empire, and the empire especially, was based on at the time. That is to say, okay, Byzantine is wrong, we should never use it, should stay away. So I'm actually positive with that. I mean, as much as I can, as you know, my policy is I call it the Roman Empire. But sometimes, in spite of, instead of doing, for example, what I did at the very beginning of this video, to say, that the Roman Empire in medieval times, you would say, oh, well, there is the Eastern Roman, you don't have to call it Byzantine. Well, actually, I reject the term Eastern Roman, and because I think it's a much deeper mistake to use the term then it is Byzantine, right? If we came up with the term Byzantine, it's an approximation. It's silly, right? But at the same time, in our languages currently, like if you dislike the term Byzantine and you are very picky about it, consider that most of the nationalities you address in your own language sometimes are actually doing portraying the same thing. Right, I make always the example of the, of the Germans in English. Are the Germans called Germans in German? No, right? Are they Allemand like the French call them? No, right? But nobody, bothers him or herself to complain with that, right? It's not if a country or people. Look at how language works, right? There are deep reasons behind certain changes that occur in language, certain words we come up with, and so on. So I'm not a fan of the term Byzantine. Every time I pronounce it, I actually feel uncomfortable about it. But at the same time, as an approximation, and given that in the Western world and in generally speaking around the globe at this point, the greatest experts, the greatest scholars about this medieval part of Roman history called themselves collectively, homogeneously, Byzantinists, right? And there is something called Byzantine studies, and the term Byzantine is still, used in all that kind of historiography. The question is, let's be very careful before judging the reasons why. One thing is how in popular culture people misuse these terms. Another matter is to realize why we still, right, in 2021, use this term at the highest levels of competence that exist in the entire world about that specific reality, which is what the overwhelming majority of people, me included, are not experts on, right, that have already addressed the problems overwhelmingly. Right, for anybody who knows that historiography knows that it's not that those guys forgot. You have to ask the greatest Byzantinists. It wasn't there was kind of a Byzantine Empire. They teach you, right, why there wasn't a Byzantine Empire, but still call themselves in that way, right? There are varieties, right, but finishing what we were saying before, the concept of Eastern Roman to me is wrong. Not conceptually, even in here. I don't want to be dogmatic either. But I stopped saying it because there are, here we should digress in more historical matters, and in part we will discuss today. I mean, the concept of Eastern Roman to me is valid exclusively as an approximation, a cultural terminology, just like Byzantine actually is. Just when the Roman Empire, it was always a unique thing, was administratively split in two, right? So this happened actually more often, first of all, than the empires, was split more than once. Normally, think about from the Tetrarchy, but also in previous. I mean, it's difficult actually to look at even at the root of the thing, because if we really want to make it a cultural problem, yes, there was a divide between the West and the East in the Roman world. If anything, just think about the overwhelming weight of Latin or Hellenic cultures, respectively, in all the various cultures that stood within that kind of more ruling element, and sometimes in conditions that didn't even weren't even scratched more than much. I mean, there were certain regions of the empire stayed formally under the Roman control for a century, the half of a millennium, but that were very superficially Romanized. And even here's somewhat an approximation sometimes, because naturally, even if you're not Romanized, things change, right? So this is all. It opens. You understand how many topics here touch, right? It opens to the concept of how which were the cultures in pre-Roman times that, for example, we know overwhelmingly true Roman sources for most of the times. Many people do not focus on this. They think as if that there was, we actually know that there was a reality and it was just that, right? And all these historiographical problems, all the, for example, knowledge of the original languages, reading the sources, that do not exist. Right, if you study the Romans, it's because those are the Romans. That there is a kind of almost nationalistic idea, as if there was an actual Roman Empire with certain characteristics. It was just that. Instead, there are other peoples were just those other kind of national thing, and they were just like that. This is a thought that, at least in universities, doesn't exist anymore. Right, it's been debunked. It's been, actually and rightfully identified like an extremely, not just as something that simply passed by itself, right? Not because it was wiped out, but literally because it wiped out itself. But that also brought to us all an enormous series of misconceptions that have been debunked in detail on the base of sound historical evidence, and that gave us back a way more complex and varied picture of those worlds practically were, right? But what I was saying is that there was a point at which, properly, even from the sources, we see clearly that even in certain titles that yes, there was an eastern half, so that was kind of the pars, as it was called, not an empire, right? This is important to stress. There were never two empires. There was never, historically, by any standard, one thing that called itself that was an empire of the West and empire of the East. The Roman Empire was one, and the reason why it was one is not a formalistic reason. It's not because some late Roman guy, some late Roman clerk in the bureaucracy out there came up with that title. The Roman Empire was unique, and with that ideology, the Roman Empire was unique because the empire was a universal symbol among all the peoples of the world in different, terms sometimes, but in the substance was exactly the same identical thing, right? From ecumenic empire to the tribes that lived at the edges of the world, that recognized in the faculty of power, in this capacity of waging properly, of governing and waging war, we were considered all once in a deeply religious idea, came in fact from the skies, and it was something that touched all the various men or peoples that fundamentally were deserving that title. And if you love the Middle Ages, if you are acquainted to the historiographical concept of the Renovatio Imperii, you know pretty well that the whole deal that partly also created the problem of the so-called Byzantine terminology actually derived from the quarrel existing between, at that point, something that was more defined as Eastern and Western, on some basis we'll partially see today, because of determining not much the imperial nature of power. But this is interesting, but actually the Romanity of it. And this is deep because, in a sense, it already speaks for the secularization of certain concepts. Like in the ancient world, everybody believed in the winged, messenger of the deity that crowned with glory and the right to rule over the defeated. In any culture, right, there is not a single people that didn't reason like that. They were all alike. Romans, Greeks, Celts, Germans, they believed the same identical thing. There was no barrier, no boundary, no cultural difference of any kind. It was everywhere. Like, it was in ancient Egypt, it was in the Achaemenid Empire, it was for Alexander, it was for everybody. Right? The symbols are all the same. The symbology is shared at all levels. There is no difference whatsoever, and they all believed in that. Also, because, objectively, there was no, religious or theological, counter-altar to that, right? Christianity, in a sense, did introduce a double thread that objectively enriched civilization, because for the first time it introduced the concept that it's not a negotiation between you and something that you can't fundamentally even realize, that it doesn't suffice just to make a sacrifice, a formal act, and to get away with that, so that you could make the deity satisfied. But you actually had to take a deeper look within yourself, with a conscience that, independently from what your actions actually were, still made a difference in the world, because it was the deeper connection with the absolute that could exist. Here it's actually another enormous topic that, as you understand, here I'm phrasing also in terms that may be profitably debated and criticized. But the question here is that, of course, Christianity introduced freedom of conscience. That's something that in the ancient world did not exist. Ancient pagan society didn't have any freedom of conscience. They had to do basically what the collectivity said, otherwise they were out. And by out means either ostracized or thrown, at the best, or thrown in swamps, or sacrificed at worst. Basically, the Roman Empire was the same thing. Christianity naturally introduced another heinous aspect that was naturally took away the freedom of cult, because those cults that were considered, which is not actually even a Christian thing, right? Even if you look at any other society, actually the idea that paganism was actually just pure freedom, whatever deity you wanted to insert in, man, yeah, it's fine. But it's actually kind of a hippie thought. It didn't work like that either. Pagans continuously destroyed each other's cultures at the end of the day, and those who supported them, they integrated them. Those that didn't support them, they wiped them out. There were specific brotherhoods, political systems that gravitated around certain sanctuaries that conflicted with others. So the delusion that, the pagan world was more or less violent than the Christian one is actually wrong. I say even less because actually even more because maybe we'll talk about it on another occasion. Today I actually wanted to make a video about this specifically. That is the concept that it's just like a religious module that made the difference overall as a broader application, right? We have this obsession that at a certain point everything changed from one day to another, right? A world moral system was imposed over another. Today, even this is not even remotely addressed historiographically. I mean, it's been completely debunked. Doesn't found any actual evidence we find of persecutions. I think that had always existed in a sense. Think about the illicit cults and the illicit cults in ancient Rome. Think about also this other competition we said before. These are things we can date back to animism, because at the end of the day, what is politism? Politism is a monotheistic invention. It never existed as we mean it. And even monotheism actually has enormous shades. That's actually the video I wanted to make today about what is, for example, medieval Christianity, right? Because certain pattern of interpretation in unitary terms are not necessarily to be ruled out, but we have to agree as sensible people on the fact, on the historical fact that there was always something different going on. In the meanwhile, even if someone believed the thing, there was someone that did something else, and very often this was also connected to the process of Christianization and superimposition and elimination of previous cults. That is to say that behind certain Christian realities and political thoughts and so on, there are also certain identities that survive from previous times, right? That even in here are not just a millenary tradition of things that were wiped out all of a sudden by this new thing coming from Palestine. No, it didn't happen like that, because those cults had changed always. Dramatically faster than we sometimes imagine, and the reasons why certain thoughts and religions actually expanded in the world were fundamentally political and social reasons, right? That were of course all one with thought, but changed gradually the same necessity of thinking certain things because they wouldn't work anymore. I digress on this actually because it's important to realize that when we speak of the medieval empire, whichever we take in consideration, we're actually addressing already a very different moral reality than it was 1,000 years before. Literally in the history of thought, in the history of morality, and there was naturally an enormous continuity, right? It's obvious that today we're much more different from those worlds, and those worlds were different of those 1,000 years ago, and it's the same amount of time, and in the last 1,000 years we have dramatically accelerated towards secularization in ways that are even difficult to, they're more difficult to explain sometimes, or than we would do for the past. But this is exactly the problem, is sometimes we forget how static, but in the sense of homogeneous, right? Not actually because things moved, that we already say that, but how homogeneous, how much the range of in terms of difference, how short it was, right? In the essentials, in the counterposition between Christianity and paganism, doesn't quite find much of a space in terms of the historical reality of how the process happened, right? And as we were saying before, when we speak of an empire, we're speaking of religion, right? There is no such thing like a secular myth could tell us, like in the past, like an empire in ancient or medieval times that was not founded on exclusively on a military and religious concept, right? When we talk about the Roman Empire, we talk about the Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, whatever we want to call all these, eventually this apparent split fundamentally in the Middle Ages. We're talking first of all about the same thing as far as the legitimacy, the core legitimacy of it, aside from the various turns that the concept might have taken, actually was, and at the same time, we're talking of an exclusively military and religious principle. That is to say, the reasons why this thing happened were a political and social necessity of pre-industrial societies to work with that idea of hierarchy, right? That, in fact, today is so different for reasons that are not what you actually believe from a personal point of view. Consider that there's no person in the world that has ever believed the same thing. Right, we think, we speak of identities, of beliefs, of stuff. There's never been. It's impossible from a scientifical, from a physical, even more than biological point of view to actually think the same thing. Every person has always had its own interpretation of whatever the world has ever been, and this is naturally the healthy way of looking at history, because single thought, of course, never existed, will never exist, but it's the reason why also humans do things, right? If it was all if it was all the same, first of all, we wouldn't live in the physical reality we do. Secondly, and obviously, there wouldn't be, like, everything would be crystallized. So if we are actually talking about, the two monolithic blocks like Christianity, paganism, etc., we do not even begin to focus on the historical reality. We are completely out of our freaking minds on the basis of historiographical acquisitions, but as we have said, also of evident physical realities, right, that we can even measure from a certain point of view. So the point I'm making here is that it changes a freaking lot in the vision of the world and of reality to pass through certain terms, and we have to understand why we talk specifically of a Byzantine Empire. Today we will actually not do it. I mean, I've made that video before, so that's properly maybe the starting point. It's a bit of a polemic video. It was interesting because many of you answered, and there was several of you who actually got precisely where I was getting to. Which I was very impressed by, because I'm kind of messy when I digress, make this stuff, not so easy to digest all at once. But it seems to me that you got the point, that we are actually just creating an image of the past from the standpoint of people that have a very few to do, at least with the level of understanding of that past. And that, however, have a lot to do with that past because we came straight from there, and it's more impacting than we imagine. That's partly also the same reason why, in fact, we make this, we have these ideas. So all this for saying that the Eastern Roman Empire never existed. Yeah, because after 476, when the Western imperial insignia were brought back to the East, what you have there is the formal recognition that not that an empire had ever been split and now was reunited, but technically that there was nobody in the West, namely that had an imperial authority. As the Roman Empire, we will talk about it tomorrow, is talking about Germanic law, had actually a territorial idea of law, right? It enforced it on the base of where you lived and how far you could reach. And by 476, we're thinking of times where, 100 years later, that would have been the major so-called properly reconquest of the West. I mean, the Roman Empire reasoned in territorial terms because naturally it was an ecumenic empire, and an ecumenic empire at that point introduces the concept that power is, universal power is actually achievable, because that's basically what Rome had done, and at the same time starts defining, given the break in territorial unity that had evidently happened with the loss of the Western provinces, and more eventually, the concept that even if you have an ecumenic ambition, by the same necessity of you declaring the need of reconquering what has been lost, you're not a universal power anymore, right? Which it's actually a flexible thing. I mean, it's not a j'accuse towards the Byzantine Empire. Of course, every power, as we were saying since the beginning, actually thought of itself like that. Like even as we were saying, the smallest tribe at the fringe of the world had its own idea that whichever, what was the range of their control. It was actually that religious military thing that had allowed them to extend further. But they also had naturally a very approximate idea of the world from a geographical point of view. So to them, the world, it was obviously the world that they knew, right? The Roman Empire had literally conquered the world. Why? Because the world was that one. Right, for a person that lived in Gaul or in Egypt, what is the world? Yes, they may know there is something else beyond, but it was objectively at the fringes of civilization, and it was something that the Romans didn't even know there was a Russia out there, right? And the question here is properly realizing the mental categories that people apparently had. And in part also the short-sightedness in terms of actual knowledge of things that today we have for granted. Like, we are all grown with satellite images of the world. We know what the hell this is. At the time, what's even the need to have a accurate geographical representation of the world? It's known. Right, the Greeks had found out, certain measures, etc., just because they were, fascinated with theoretical calculation. They got it right? But the rest of the people, Romans included, didn't give a damn, because what's the use? The Romans drew maps that were just, how do I get from here to there? But who the hell cared objectively? But what was the practical application of creating an actual map that would draw what the world was at the time? There was no practical application whatsoever. Nobody cared, rightfully, right? Even Ptolemy, we think he actually created this atlas of the world by just calculating the coordinates in latitude and longitude, but without even drawing the freaking map. That is, this guy spent a lifetime collecting an astonishing amount of data for his time standard with his own time means to create properly this coordinate, this net system, and he didn't even draw the map over them, as far as we understand. But that's exactly the problem. When you have a knowledge and understanding of the world, like one could be in ancient times, and you acknowledge that you're not the sole ruler, as it had been in early imperial times, and that this thing now is split, and that there are eventually, as it would be since the 9th century, not just a real power, such as, I don't know, the Merovingians could have been back in the day, in the 6th century, but a power that defines itself specifically as Roman Empire, right? And that you do not want to recognize, especially not the imperial character, but the Romanity of, and that's the extremely fascinating thing from Constantinople we're talking about. There starts happening a lot of stuff that actually is at the same base, in many ways, of the, and especially in the West, in my opinion, of the foundation of much of our political and juridical accomplishments up to this point. I'm a bit cryptic here, but first of all, you understand the problem. The Byzantines at that point, let's call it that way, because that's where I use to oppose the thing, compared to the Franks, to properly stress the fact that this problem, you see how semantically, how you can't use a word fittingly, because if I said, the Romans and the Franks, then it would sound like, I'm just from that side, right? But they weren't themselves, because Constantinople was willing to recognize an empire, right? And they surely, with all the ambiguities, with all the fact of recognizing that that was not the truly holy empire, was not their own, it was not the Roman one, because the Roman had become properly the definition of what that empire really was, right? And that's how deeply, that first of all, that tells you they had interiorized after the Islamic advance and the contraction also of the West, within the West, the cultural character amidst this all people, that what at that point historians, including some of the greatest Byzantinists, have started to call properly Byzantine. Right here I have an extract from John Haldon, that is not really one of the least people that have something to say in terms of what is Byzantine, and he even used the term Eastern Roman Empire, right, which I abhor, because I think it's disgusting and false and wrong, and it doesn't take into consideration specifically the fact that there was no Eastern Empire, that even when Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope, with all the ambiguity and the... I actually sympathize for the thing, right? In legalistic matter, I say, yes, objectively Constantinople was right. Right, but what happened in Rome on Christmas Eve of 800, or Christmas Day actually, it's something that creates an important divide that is not anymore like the empire and all these other barbarian peoples out there. No. Here you have a fully Catholic power, because the schism didn't exist. I mean, Rome and Constantinople were part of the same church. In theory, even in there were important changes that had already taken place. Crown a guy that has an empire that stretches from freaking Aquitaine to freaking Germany, from freaking Britannia to freaking Central Italy, that is an immense thing, right? Which has an enormous power, has developed a military machine that is properly based on a core of professionals that is the West had never seen since Roman times, and the question here is, how do you cope with that? The Byzantines recognize they could have said this is no empire. Do you know why they didn't do that? Because they actually believed in that old military religious principle of empire. They couldn't deny that Charlemagne was a freaking power on his own, right? That the Carolingian Empire was something that had a real imperium as it was defined in Roman terms. And that it would have been silly to make, I don't know, some average guy at the fringes, on the frontiers with the same Byzantine Empire, because that's the point where the Franks had a standard, that didn't exist. Now look, you don't have to look at that because that's not true. Don't worry, look just from our side, look towards the east. No, they had to acknowledge that was an empire, but they wouldn't acknowledge this is if you want, the secularization, the cultural touch, and even the admission of some kind of shortcoming at that point, that the criterion was not the imperium like it was in ancient times. Rome conquers the world. There's just one empire. The gods are with her. That's it. They made it, right? The god, actually, because even in pagan terms, there's one god of, they are to confer specifically the military glory of the skies and the faculty to rule over the vanquished. No, here they come up with the Romanity of it. And in my opinion, that is important, because we should go back even to ancient times, how the Romans defined themselves, especially in relation to their expansion and to their mission. The Romans were truly convinced to be a chosen people, right? They're not just the Jews. After the Jews, the Romans are that, right? And after that, they are the Franks, essentially, since an early age, because they realized that there was no question they would have ruled the world. It's not that it could happen or couldn't happen. They knew it would happen, right? And the question here is just realizing that when things get more complicated by crisis, normally, like the one that existed in medieval times, in terms of, at least of the composition of this political reality, because everybody had in mind the empire, right? It's not that the Western fell and it was from that side said, oh, the empire does not exist. Everybody up to Northern Europe knew that it was a Roman Empire. We're all freaking terrified at the idea that they could at some point be reincorporated in this thing, and they did as much as they could actually to secure their own share of Romanity, so that they could exploit also the imperial thing. This is particularly important because it was born like within the arbor, within the boundaries of the same Romanity that was recognized at that point as something intrinsic to the Roman people. This is fascinating, right? That's how the Romans had properly won the thing. I mean, the Romans had not just conquered the world, they had properly Romanized the whole thing. They had made a city of what before was the world. This is how Namatzianos phrased the thing. And the reason why they had done it is that they had permeated this world with the military glory of the sky. Through the conquest, it was not just wiping out everybody they found in front of themselves, but also good amount of time compared to ancient world standards were actually pretty, generous in that terms of brutality, to actually become these people Romans themselves, which was not, just a mere administrative legal thing. It was literally saying you can participate to the military glory as long as you deserve it, right? The concept of munus, of the idea of duty but also reward at the same time, is the base of our civil, our civilization at so many levels. In the West, that's why the Roman symbols are present basically in any country in the world, as the Western world, as far as the politics, government, law, etc. is, even countries that were properly to develop not in the wake of a properly Romanistic, for example, juridical tradition, right? The Roman, the U.S. Senate has a fascium in its own code, right? It's something deep there. It's not just the eagle as a concept of, that the chosen bird that was the only one that could look into the with the eyes in the sun, and therefore was the actual messenger from the military glory of the sky of the heavens to land, right? It's something deeper in terms of what objectively the Romanity had become. So that when the Germans arrived, not only they eventually leave things standing and they actually take from it, but they properly realized that the international arena, they had to behave as Romans to benefit from important legitimacy and authority in and out, in foreign and domestic affairs alike, and that's also why Charlemagne was crowned like that. These are huge topics. We made actually videos about the Renovatio Imperii. If you look, I've made a playlist about the Holy Roman Empire. You find something there. This is very important because nobody there was not a unanimous, for example, acceptance of the Romanity, especially in those realities. Like think about the Ottonians that were actually emerging from areas that had not even been part of the Roman Empire, and that looked at their Germanness, let's say, as a qualitative matter. The fact that the Germans had won what the Romans had, so they were actually superior. That was their mindset, actually. But you know better than I do that the Ottonians are the ones that bring the Roman title to the. It's not the Frankish Empire anymore; it's the Roman one, right? And this causes some problems, but. That's quite meaningful because it makes you understand that what the empire was revived in intensity, not because it had ever ceased. The actual need to become Roman at an international level in the 10th century still was overwhelming. Here also I forgot something very important that could the concept that when reevaluating this, I believe that Schwerpunkt, especially from some time onwards, has addressed consistently. It's a more kind of Western and specifically Latin Germanic view of the Middle Ages that is actually present in the Western world because for obvious reasons, but also because objectively we know dramatically more about the West, which began to do things that were to surpass the rest, and that's a powerful realization that I don't want to say it's tied to any. Don't make me say things that I could regret expanding on, but I promise we'll discuss them individually in detail. What I meant specifically is that when you consider the you see, by the 9th century, the Roman Empire could oppose itself to what happened in Rome with Charlemagne, right? But if you had asked a Roman of, say, the 5th century BC, and you had asked him, what is the Imperium? Aside from the fact that we have very foggy understanding of certain times and space, whatever, but the concept of at least of the military glory of the sky, let's rearrange it in this sense. The guy would have told you that whoever won had that's not something that can be restricted by a legalistic claim on only like the Byzantines did rightfully in terms of late Roman juridical standards, that for example only an emperor could appoint another emperor. That is to say that only it was also right in terms of actual at least of delegation of power, but just confined to that, actually not ignoring willingly at that point how to win an empire on your own, which is what the Franks did. It was like that you can only an emperor can delegate another emperor. It was actually true, right? Because he was the guy who owned the power, right? And that's also a very big change compared to well, at least how the concept of an empire had been developed originally, in part, or at least not quite. But I mean, it was obvious that, I don't know, late Roman emperor was not the only guy thanks to which the empire existed in practice, right? So that he didn't have the full. It was a necessity to have a monarch in some measure, and that also depended on the balance of that society. But the question is subtler. But the problem is that the empire had been born exactly through that base. Whoever is powerful enough has the empire. You have it. If you manage to crush your enemy, you have been blessed by the military glory of the skies. And there is nothing else to that, right? You know, the Christian view of this had added, of course, a patina of, of cohesion, of consistency, of, obedience towards authority. I mean, the idea that, you have to make properly a state work well, but it hadn't touched objectively. And even if you read the Bible, actually, it fits pretty damn well to that idea of an empire at the same time. So it's all very flexible, as we were saying at the beginning, and the reason why we should reevaluate very carefully what happened in the West is exactly that. At the end of the day, that West overwhelmed the East, right? And that's where we even stopped talking properly of a Roman state for real, because whatever happened with the Paleologi dynasty after the Fourth Crusade has never been this state, which was an exception, right? Especially in Christian Europe, and also the caliphates were basically an inspiration, a copy of the Roman Empire, in terms of especially of centralized state, bureaucracy, professional, permanent army, and so on. But what we talk by saying by Byzantine, this is what Haldon here. I'm reading. I actually taking free inspiration here from this statement. Is that what I won't paraphrase it, but what he's saying is stating at the end of the day is that when we study like Byzantine history, at the end of the day, we're looking at a system that emerged with all approximations, with all the debatable boundaries, something either between the fourth and or the sixth. So mostly Constantine or Justinian as the beginning, and the 12th century up to basically 1204, right? So at the beginning of the 13th, as something on its own, right? Actually, he stresses what is definitely true, and that had a dramatic change at the end of the day, and I think it's a much more spot on. In fact, Haldon is that the guy knows his business, that there's much more impacting and properly culturally defining moment in Roman history that are the Islamic invasions, right? Because that literally make the empire shrink at a level that had been unprecedented, but also posed the empire on the defensive in an existential term that was so deeply interiorized and enclosed the empire on certain specific communities that had been just like a small part of the previous Roman Empire, right? That of course, the cultural impact that, in relative terms, this had on the same Roman state conferred certain characters to the same that we can't speak of something different, right? And nobody cares that these were actually lawfully the Roman Empire, which was till the very end. But nobody can take out the idea that even if it was something that had gone through an important change that we must point out, at least, not because the previous Roman Empire hadn't had changes. What do you think? That Rome was the same at the time, I don't know, of Furius Camillus, or at the time of Publio Cornelius Scipio, or the time of Caesar, at the time of Nero, at the time of Marcus Aurelius? If Scipio had seen what was the empire at the time of Hadrian, would have had a heart attack, right? What kind of Romanity was that? So let's also get acquainted to the fact that, yes, it's objectively silly to consider the term Byzantine without considering all the various modifications that Romanity went through in previous times, right? This is rarely done, because people, when they get obsessed about Byzantine stuff, because that's how it happens when you go to university. You go to university, you discover that the Byzantine Empire was not the bullshit you were being told when you went to school, and by all the the various prejudices and so on. So you say, oh wow, it's the greatest thing ever, it's great, we're the true ones, all the others were bastards, were barbarians, were not Romans, etc. Then gradually, when you pass, where your hormones go down, fortunately, after the first minute of your training, you start, using your brain a bit more, and you realize that the thing is way more complicated, as we've tried to address up to this point, and especially in as much as there was another empire, or at least somebody claiming that they held a comparative power, and it's actually the same power, right? Because when the Westerners created their own thing, they didn't reason in terms of, like, now we want to create another empire to pretend that we, that the Byzantines are not the Romans, for example, or that we are, the Romans, but we're actually not. They knew that it was a problem internationally to have that kind of recognition, but it was not much the legalistic problem there was, or the dynastic one. It was also surpassed, in some ways at some point at least. But it was properly because that was an empire that had a completely different base compared to the Byzantine one. Why? Because that was a state proper, as we were saying before. We have to recognize that, of course, there were deep differences between the Hellenic East and the Latin West. Since even before all these times, it's since Roman times. Look at how Augustus portrayed himself in front of the Romans. It was just a first among equal citizens, and how he portrayed himself in front of Egyptians, that he was basically a pharaoh, basically a demigod. And so the question is here realizing that there's never been an homogeneity in the first place, that the Romans surely had an aggressive and imperialistic mindset that they surely could develop because they had reached certain levels of civilization, and that it was not because of, technology or predatory nature or evil, but it was because they were a freaking civilization, because they had a political and social cocktail that never been seen in the history of mankind, and that made literally eventually from there on the history of mankind. And they, however, had this capacity to assimilate, to extend their own citizenship, their own to integrate and to consolidate, especially because of this thoughtful double thread. Remember when I said the thing about Christianity before? Well, the Romans had initiated the idea that after all, there was, a negotiation, not just with the deities. That is, I deserve it in terms of military virtue. You make me win, right? But with people, that is to say, you can participate to that if you demonstrate you can work hard, which is a hell of an idea, and that paved the road to the extension of Christianity and freedom of conscience, because you understand what's the matching there. It's properly realizing that it takes a commitment that also goes beyond the formality of it. And the fact that Christianity took over eventually within the Roman Empire and also expanded beyond, it's actually a very meaningful picture. That Christianity basically expanded also beyond the territories of the Roman Empire autonomously. Right, or at least it was always a matter of elites, where in another, as we were saying in the beginning, also this was a very gradual process, and I don't digress further on this, but this is the Romanity that we can identify naturally in the state of the Byzantine state that lived on, but that it was also left in legacy, and in a living legacy, in the West, that had important problems to solve, because the Romano-Germanic hybrid was also not to be given for granted. Right? The West had here, maybe we should make a video about the factors, and in my opinion at least, were, because said there was some of you who asked me actually, what is that made the West, right? And went the way that there is nothing deterministic about it. But of course there are specific dynamics that are both spiritual and both material, let's say, that must be very carefully analyzed, that have to do really with the way these mechanisms work, that other countries in the world, other areas didn't have. Or if they had it, at least it was not in the same, with the same balance, with the same measure, with the same extremely fragile mixture that I believe we are losing at a certain point. This doesn't come like a magic formula. That's why it's not a deterministic thing, right? But if you look at the philosophies of the ideas of these people, you start realizing that the core of our values, of our rights, of our principles are there, right? And they're not to be given for granted, because the same West at a point didn't give a damn about the equality of human beings. Didn't care about whether you could, there was an exclusivistic principle at the base of this the area of rule. There was no public culture, right? There's no state. I mean, humanity grows over time, right? And so there are many other important civilizations that accomplish extraordinary things, more than the West in certain moments in history. Okay? But at the same time, we have to look at a world like early medieval times that objectively didn't promise much compared to other areas in the world, apparently, right? That's also a bit of an idea that in the West we discovered that there's someone else out there, right? While the others still haven't, maybe, or they don't like it. It's all about themselves, right? And we had this realization that struck us and brought us maybe to the extreme of saying, oh yes, but there were also others that did that. Yes, but not quite the same thing, which is valid also, in terms of praising other people's accomplishments, right? But at the same time, yes, according to me, there are specific traits that made the West the West. Including the fact that we had to solve a freaking deal of problems. Right? Don't think, for example, that Roman legacy was just, a positive, practical, applicational one. It is to say, there was the Roman state, let's make it rework. Doesn't work like it, right? They tried in other historical periods. They tried it during the French Revolution. It ended pretty bad, right? It ended actually not in a republic as the revolutionaries wanted, but into another empire with Napoleon. And there is a reason why there are elites, and there is a reason why also such things pass through warfare, unfortunately, but also with a reason, right? And it's exactly as we were saying before, the political military events that consumed themselves between 630 and 50, so we're talking about the Arab invasion from one side, and in the 13th century with the conquest of Constantinople from the side of the armies of the Fourth Crusade, and the constitution of a provisional so-called Latin Empire. We made a video recently about this military organization. Enclose, this is what Haldon says, from the 7th to all the 12th century, certain elements that appear very strong and that constitute, therefore, the heart of what also we will talk about on Schwerpunkt when speaking of properly, or not properly, but improperly, but specifically of the Byzantine era. Naturally, this is just an approximation. It's didactical, right? And what is fascinating, in fact, is how much from you see, having the West sometimes really, it was the West who discovered the Byzantine Empire. I mean, let's be honest about it. These were lands also that were conquered by a power that you wouldn't consider Western, like the Ottomans, right? That were actually deeply Westernized in character, and that they accomplished also a big deal of their things because of the legacy of the Roman Empire and so on. But specifically, we got so impressed by this lack of interest towards Constantinople that objectively for a long time existed, right, as now is being filled, sometimes even too much, right? I don't know how many publishing there's been on Constantine or whatever. That it's always, at the end of the day, basically the same things, and how much, at least, there is about an overwhelming amount of Western history. Nobody gives a freaking damn of it, starting from the early medieval times and the Middle Ages. I think the most disgusting lack of interest in our popular cultures towards the Low Middle Ages. Like, it's a time that we stereotyped, like, in a disgusting way in the 19th century. Like, the overwhelming majority of people do not even think of. First of all, it's a mistake to think of the Middle Ages as well, but they just think through 19th century literature, right? It's not that they actually know what the Middle Ages were. That's why we make so many videos about it, attempting at least to fluidify certain pictures. I don't know what I was saying, but because I make too long periods, but in digressions. But I was getting to the concept that we also got so amazed by what Constantinople was that we decided to swallow it all together without, as we're doing, well, fortunately at this point, analyzing it in detail, right, and tasting it every single bit to understand how actually complex the thing was, so that we also came up with all-encompassing interpretations about this reality, and providing interpretations that are fundamentally wrong, and that, in spite of the respect that seems to have, I would say, surprisingly developed also in popular culture towards the Byzantine Empire. First of all, however, still disgusting because it ignores everything that happened around, because, once again, our understanding of the Middle Ages altogether is utterly appalling. But that, let's say, sometimes we interpret through all the historiographical, but even more, ideological patterns. Such as the concept of decline, right? The idea that the Byzantine Empire at the end of the day was just a long decline. Even here, it's important to use a double thread. Certain hard facts cannot be cancelled. Objectively, the empire struggled, right? It's a bit of, it's been stereotyped as kind of something too enclosed in itself, too incapable of changing, too in love with itself at a certain point. The question here is, surely there was some of that. It's an historical reality, at least from also what the same Byzantines actually wrote about themselves. But at the same time, it wasn't all like that, right? And the reason why we have this picture is also that there was a very strong oligarchy that naturally tended to be conservative and reactionary toward the external, but at some point denying or ignoring the actually denying, because ignoring it, they weren't stupid actually at all, but denying for betting on the wrong horse that there would be another way to make things work. And the empire did actually change consistently within, even during this century. We're talking about half of a millennium. It wasn't always the same thing. There were changes, but at the same time, these changes, like also it happened in other countries at some point, were sometimes lost. There were deliberate political choices to make things go in another direction. There were also those who tried to open, right, but they didn't make it on the long run. Also, or they maybe did it, it was not enough. Also, there were simply things that went dramatically bad, right? If you think about the Fourth Crusade, if you analyze the years preceding it, it's not that it was a specific crisis in the empire, things were going bad. No, right? You say, oh no, how? Mediocephalon was not the disaster. As, believe me, not even Manzikert was that disaster. Right, those things have been abused. Also, nobody underestimates the dramatic impact it had, the negative one. Yes, but I don't know. Mediocephalon happened because basically the Byzantines had managed to reconquer all they had lost after Manzikert and lost again, right? And so that already tells you, in practice, that those weren't more deadly blows, right? The worst actually was 1204. Yes, and even in there we have made the simplistic thing of it's just evil, Westerners would destroy them. No, that's also a complete invention that we use, in fact, to justify. You see, these reactionary attitudes towards history that are pretty silly, because just like the empire fell in that way, such ideas fall, right, without even realizing why they did, right? And it's much better to understand why it happened. And the Byzantines had their own share of responsibility, also simply because they were the ones who invited the Crusades to solve their dynastic struggles, fratricide problems, and eventually they didn't know how to dislodge these guys anymore, because the Fourth Crusade otherwise was launched with the best intentions. Yes, just because the Crusaders didn't have money, the Venetians diverted them to conquer the Hungarian Tsar, but at the end of the day, that was just an expedition like others that were happening, and there were similar events in some sense. It's not that the Byzantines ever liked the Crusaders that much since the beginning, as you know, so you can't get here the extremely articulated picture that we should all take way more seriously into consideration, looking at the specialized bibliography and realizing all the things we need to know before expressing certain simplistic judgments. But today I also wanted to open another question relative to the broader cultural, religious, political, juridical, orthodox koine. That is something even there expanded, as you know, far beyond the empire. We're talking of a essentially Slavic Orthodox world, which is also enormously overlooked, and often for sometimes reevaluated for the wrong reasons. That Haydn said the most important ones that are way deeper than this usually portrayed. I hope that in the next, in the future, because I don't know how, I randomly pick these topics, as you know, we will talk about specifically the history of medieval Slavic countries, right? And that's, I know many of you are actually from the Slavic countries, or at least from certain realities also that have been overlooked generally in Europe, given also the complicated picture of a big chunk of Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe that we constantly ignore for reasons that are even here difficult to touch. And maybe I feel I don't insist too much as I should, honestly, because at the end of the day, I also, as we were saying before, I mostly make Latin Germanic history, but there is a lot of Latin and Germanic aspects that are overlooked, right? Definitely most of what happened in medieval Europe in terms of sheer concentration of people, wealth, production of any level, it's of course from that side, but this has nothing to do with the fact that this system existed just because there was a reality around that we tend to differentiate, right? I mean, let's be honest, most of our manuals today are still used in schools, universities, etc. Trace this boundary, right? As far as I've seen, the Anglo-Saxon world has a more kind of Northern European perspective as a whole, so it's yet another picture, but it's still kind of Northwestern, right? And other, like continental, of course, in the way I don't know much about Eastern Europe, honestly. I guess that there are issues with education in the first place, that it's not easy to come out of socialism all of a sudden, and to, even after some decade, to have to cope with certain obvious problems that have to do with simply how they're not much what the world is about, but specifically with the relation with that world. Believe me, because I've had strong connections, sentimental ones, with that world, and I know what it means, and I find it fascinating. I've learned some of the most beautiful things about history, about the world, about myself, thanks to those experiences. And the question here is, I realize, because I often talk about Europe, and I would like Schwerpunkt to be, obviously, everybody, wherever you come from, I'm honored by your attention, and this is for everybody by the slightest. But of course, it's obvious that I have my bias, not because I always try to be unbiased as far as political, questions are, but of course, I know just more about certain things than others. So I know it's my limit, and I have to acknowledge it, because otherwise I wouldn't be honest with you, and you wouldn't trust me. But, or at least you wouldn't, you'd think it's biased, and you wouldn't accept my evidence as, with the criticism that attached to it. But the question is, I want Schwerpunkt to be specifically a European thing, right? I believe that there is, that Europe must have a future of unity and of protagonism in the world, right? And definitely it's frustrating as a European to see how distant from this reality from this picture reality is, right? And therefore, when I pose myself in front of certain enormous parts of what Europe should become, I realize why we fail. And the reason is that we don't have the courage to study our own history for what it's really been. Not for what alt-right or leftist reasons are, which are probably some of the greatest shames in the history of mankind. Like, these are kind of, what happened in the 20th century, independently, even if it happened, let's say, fascism and communism are one of those things for which every person in the world should wake up in the morning and feel ashamed for being part of the human race. Together, of being naturally proud for other things, right? But we live still in a world that has come out of that it was yesterday, right? So, and in some places in the world, unfortunately, it's still in force. Also, part of the reason why we have a pandemic going on, and my opinion in this regard is that the more we acknowledge, in an expansive sense, about our own history, the better we can do, right? And that's why enclosing ourselves, like the Romans back in the day, in the 7th centuries, were obliged to do. Today we're not obliged. And we do it, within the mental traps, the boundaries, the cages we create for no reason, for no valid reason. This is a declaration of weakness. Right? This means that there's something seriously wrong. Not even Freudian character, but specifically of intellective problems. That is to say, we're too stupid to understand certain things. Right? And that's exactly the problem. The more you know, and the greater the chances are that you're going to fix that. Right? So that's why education, that's why knowledge is the medicine. It's the cure. Right? And that's why it's important, in my opinion, to expand on these topics. I was reflecting briefly about this today, about the Slavic Orthodox world, and pointing out essentially two things. About the Middle Ages specifically. This world, in a way or another, was basically incorporated in something else, right? That was sucked in, away in a part from the rest of Europe. What are we talking specifically about? So the Byzantine Empire in itself, as a monad, was definitely not enclosed. It was definitely permeable, right? It was not shut down to anything, but surely had this conservative character, and it fit in the West as well, as we know, right? Today we talk about, Greece is who has the courage to say it is not a Western country. Or when you think about certain characters of think about Constantinople itself, right? That's a symbol of the West, right? Not just because it's physically in Europe, but specifically because when you go there, you can see that past, right? But at the end of the Middle Ages, this thing was swallowed by the Ottomans. By the 13th century, another huge chunk of this, and a specific Slavic Orthodox reality on its own, that is, the Kievan Rus, was raised by the Mongols, right? And Russia actually was not swallowed entirely, as you know, but it basically became, and this is something that is dramatically overlooked, it became essentially a Mongol-dependent state, right? They were vassals of the Golden Horde, and they were dramatically influenced at all levels of political and social and military, especially political and military, by the Mongols, right? Pre-Mongol Russia and post-Mongol Russia are two very different things. And we made some videos about this specifically, but I hope we'll come back on it because it's of dramatic importance. The easternness sometimes comes very close to us because, geographically speaking, because this broader, think about the word of the steppe, right? And this, the broader instability that this brought, just think about the Ukrainian steppe that were actually the Kievan Rus had stood as something imposant. We look at the remains of that and we say, wow, this thing was really big, right? It was a civilization. Things changed, evidently. Balances were shifted, centers of powers were shifted. But there is also, for example, this corridor that goes from, around the Carpathians, from the steppes, and it goes down the Danube and comes up to the Pannonian Plain. That is pretty damn close, right? The steppes end, there, at the gates of Western Europe, right? So it's that's also a reality that had an important type of history, and we abandoned briefly, not so briefly, but compared to previous times, a bit stressing this world of the steppe that literally kept emanating waves over waves that impacted Europe for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries. That's why the Western perspective said, no, we are, as West as you can imagine, let's not think about what happened just, a little bit east of us. But it's basically it's your home, right? And most of what we even conceive in terms of our own, knighthood, or even previous time, you talk about Celtic mythology, these are all stuff that received dramatic impulses, and we come from there. Like Indo-Europeans, as their broader, the population and their culture and so on, they live in the Caucasus, between the Caucasus and the Dniester River, right? And that's something that how do you actually cope with if you exclude that reality from your side? So unfortunately, the way these realities are revived are done for kind of sense of malaise rather than a positive understanding, because in part they're difficult to interpret through dominant Western patterns of historical interpretation that make also those countries that are being now fully after socialism, and say reacquainted fully with that perspective. Not that historically, yes. Just certain maybe the Western Slavs, of course, were, and for the reason I pointed out here, these weren't Orthodox, right? They were Catholics. They belonged to a wholly different thing. But we're speaking about the East, or even part of the Balkans. There we're talking about serious distances that are not serious because the people are actually different from us. We're the same, right? We have our own differences, but like any people has, but that should be considered. We should consider each other as the same, given what we went through, given what our roots are, given what this has all been about since ever, right? But that still, for certain reasons, now we can't descend on, that are mostly of political nature, sometimes at a popular level, chiefly take different paths. This doesn't. It's not just popular, unfortunately. We were talking even about higher grades of politics. I mean, look at how. Here, even if I start making specific examples, I will trigger you excessively. But I'm talking specifically of obvious. Think about, the enmity between Russia and NATO in general. At a political, strategical level. That's real, right? And we all know what it's about. But that unfortunately came to touch certain historical interpretations that unfortunately are, as such, not historical at all. Right? These are things that happen even, within the United States, about the Civil War, about that, we have had actually historiographies that emerged from, even Russia actually had pretty good, historiographical tradition in spite of the, the different level of, democratic development and so on. Think about Soviet archaeology. We're talking about big things here. But, in the United States, well, we all came up. We always cooperated at some level, right? It was never like we shut down everything and we didn't communicate. We always, when, contrast hybridizes, right? The question is, we are evolving, right? Where we actually did well at some level, we are denying it in some way. Right, with an enormous, and not because, you see, back in the day, very stupid things were said, and we fixed them, and we fixed them with actual evidence, with actual scientific method. When this method is denied, as it's happening today, that is to say, emotions take over, facts. The question starts being quite serious, right? Because one thing is having a different perspective. One thing is denying an accomplishment, right? Hell, we study in historiography, rightfully, even those who are wrong. At least, given the historiographical standards have been required to at university. You have to know even what authors of the 18th or the 19th or the 20th centuries thought, because nobody cares whether they were wrong for their own time standards. They actually added something we still work on today, and it actually still worked, right? Might have been a few that worked, the more distant it becomes, but still there's been a positive improvement. Now this is being denied because it's much easier to just erase the past, to reshape people's minds according to your own will. And it's not even a strictly political question. It's easier from an economical point of view. It's like saying, it's obviously the same thing, but it's not even. You don't even have to think that those who exploit people in this way are actually very intelligent themselves. They just find short-term solutions to exploiting, temporary people's stupidity that naturally can be fueled in process as well. But it's not a greater scheme that these people who knows how many capacities. But it takes just a highly skilled scholar that debunks you every bullshit like that with actual scientific literature, and you're done for, right? And we do not give space to those people. This is the problem, right? This is a great problem. We don't like competence anymore, because competence makes you confront with reality and doesn't make you, believe to live in a world of fairy tale. The problem being that you need to believe to be in a world of fairy tale because your life sucks and you don't have any alternative, because you're a failure in turn and you prefer to surrender because you're weak to this kind of enticing and not to do something about with your life. Well, history gives you a big slap in the face, because history doesn't give a damn about who you are. It doesn't at all. So it's the best master you can find, right? And that's why being unbiased is so important, as much as you can, given that nobody can be, but that we all are. in fact. So the point I wanted to make is actually very simple. The fact is that this chunk of Europe, also given the same Byzantine sources, you see, in the Latin Germanic world, more or less, we are well documented, right? When we enter the Byzantine Empire, it doesn't matter how advanced it was, and even in here we should maybe be a bit more objective at certain levels, but let's say that there is a completely different historiography. So all the problem, for example, of the Slavic migrations, that is also very debated, because many people, I see there is this increasing need. Some do it for essentially nationalistic reasons, but others, I suspect, they're actually genuine in stating how the West has dramatically ignored how that world actually worked. When we think about Slavic migrations, it's definitely true. Like, that's something I actually, I made on the base of my own historiography. Can be updated, but as any other. But that's fundamentally what we teach around. That there was this major wave of Slavization. They weren't properly confederacies. They became, they came to speak eventually. We can't trace the thing linguistically speaking, but it's not clear, right? It's not clear at all which groups did what. Also the fact that these were all, the middle shepherds of peoples, like these Turkic populations, or Ugrian Turkic populations from the steppes that came and, brought the Slavs here and there. I don't think it's also a completely accurate picture. Also, we must acknowledge that, in spite Eastern Europe was definitely less developed than the West, and that therefore it's obvious that we have less information, that even just less things happened because there were less people, there was less wealth, so it was a colder world in a way. But the question is, whatever it happened, we have a great difficulty in finding the paradigms to evaluate what actually happened on the basis of how we abbreviated from Latin Germanic sources, right? They are way more insightful. Even when society there was no state like in Constantinople, when everything was more, but paradoxically produced exactly for that reason, a much more critical understanding. Because there was not a fixed order of a monarchy, of a state that rigidly controlled a big deal of things. People had their own say, and we can understand more. And this is deep, because other people studied that in turn. There was a greater plurality of sources, of opinions, centers of power, and this is characteristic of medieval Europe at many levels. Whereas when you look at the eastern chunk, you have this bulky Byzantine state, and then you have this, communities are, however, invested every once in a while by this kind of nomadic waves that also have greater problems at that point of actually stabilizing power, because we were saying it, for example, of the Kievan Rus, that was actually sedentary, also a florid thing. Yes, before the Mongol invasions actually had began to decline, right? But that's a pattern that can be in part also assimilated was what would happen in the West. But the Mongols come and raise everything, right? And there are all these populations of nomadic nature. It's a bit like happened in Asia Minor after Manzikert, right? Asia Minor was actually very well irrigated. The Turks bring in pastoralism. Many areas go desertified. There is a completely different use of the land, a different culture, right? There is also a lot of commixtions as well, but still, these are worlds that might have had a different history, right? We could make a video even saying, well, what if, I don't like what ifs, honestly, but, what if the empire had not fallen? Our history would be completely, the same concept of Westernness probably would have not existed. Probably. Not just because we would have witnessed this imposing center stretching between Europe and Asia still as a solid state with this military tradition, etc. But also because we would have not had the Ottoman wars that are consistently the most, the main reason why we can narrowly speak of a specifically Western Europe and not considering something on a broader scale, right? because that idea was properly created by the clash with the Ottoman Empire, without which we wouldn't have not had the same idea. That before the Ottomans, the Europeans didn't conceive themselves as Westerners as we intend as today. So, given all the problems that might have existed, I presume, actually, let's be honest, the fact is that we can know also less. Right, the historiographies of Eastern countries are, let's say, they have other problems to acknowledge. First of all, because it's not easy to lead to have a view like the one communism enforced in some areas. I mean, turning churches into stables, or there is heavy damage there that has to be seriously fixed, and that has been a dramatic culture, has been a dramatically cultural impact on those societies. But at the same time, we know less. Like, the sources are not available. There are not. Like, one of you was asking me, I mean, I think it was made, let's say, it was a video on 13th century Russia and something like that. Some of you asked me, but where do you get more information from this? Are there Russian military archives about 13th century Russia? First of all, why there would have been military archives? These are things you can't find in chronicles that, if anything, are all published since centuries. But, the question is, more or less what we know about those worlds, except archaeology can do more. This is true. Also because way less has been done at some levels. But the Balkans, we were talking before about actually the Soviet Union, and they had the means to excavate, to do very important stuff, but also in there for specific reasons, sometimes with specific interests. But pick the Balkans. The Balkans have a history that is something devastating. It's exceptional. They have some of the highest levels of archaeological certification in Europe, and much less has been done. Right, for obvious reasons. They had a completely different relation with certain issues, etc. But and means capabilities at the end of the day. But we also have less. And it's and this myth of the Byzantines, it's so mysterious and all this stuff because it's so archaic, it's so arcane, right? Think even about Russian icons, right? If you look at Russian icons during the 13th century, it seems as if Russian knights were all about Byzantine panoply, right? You look at archaeology, you realize there was something very different at many levels, especially after the Mongol conquest, and you start appreciating concretely these things only when you realize that we have forgotten them, right? That we have properly taken out of our sight, and the reason why they were kept like that is also partly because somebody didn't have the courage to admit that certain changes were concrete in there. And there is a lot of tension. Let's be honest, most of the comments I get, in polemical terms, it is a pretty good indicator. It's when I talk about Eastern Europe, right? Say, there's always the guy who says, no, that people was not there, or, they were there before, it's all a myth, it's all a lie, it's all, of course, sometimes it's just wrong, because it's just a rant, because of peoples that also had important political problems that they need to stress their national identity in areas that are also more unstable, they had interesting developments from that point of view, so that struggled more more anxiously for defining that and that identity specifically. But I'm starting to suspect that in part that I see them because I see that their comments are genuine sometimes. They're not driven by hatred most of the times. They're really asking you to give a better check to that. And this is something somebody who is listening, who is maybe a historian or just has maybe the possibility or the interest to talk about these things broadly. that's something we have to start pointing out. It could be actually a very functional, important, effective way to bridge certain realities of Europe that only believed to be distant, and they aren't, and that can learn so much from one another and becoming stronger in the process. This is what I truly believe. And I do it as a historian, but especially as a European. And especially, I do it because I'm curious, right? The only reason why I believe in this thing is because I believe that, the more you know, the better you can do, right? And it's beautiful to know. It's exciting. It's satisfying. And especially when you get things done and you start really making the difference in that field. So I say this also because I realized that most of stuff I talk about is sometimes repetitive. And I realize it's repetitive because it's what I've learned from certain repetitive historical interpretations, which has nothing to do with subverting the thing, which giving up to the lunacies of those who want to see just feel vindicated from a political point of view. It's properly, but history is policy at the same time. There is a medium, right? There is a balance. And that that deserves to be searched. And it seems to me that these things are causing more attrition than else. If you start from history and you start teaching kids that the reason why they should study the history of their own country is the same reason for which they should study the history of the world, well, then we can maybe have a better world for real, and to do something better for ourselves and for those who will come next, right? If we were to trace just a difference between East and West, especially as far as the Byzantine world is concerned, Haldon says we can look at this. First of all, the permanence of a true state that administrates, that regulates, that is literally that is the hair of the, let's say, ancient Roman Empire. And this doesn't make much sense. But given that contraction we're talking about after the 7th century, you can perceive the difference more. An empire, the prestige of which was supported by the sacrality of the figure of the Christian emperor. Right? This is perhaps also one of the single most important things ever, if not the most important. I mean, this was the only Christian empire for a very long time, right? Because since the late 4th century, this thing had properly been the Christian Roman Empire, and it was nothing else like that for almost other. How do you make 500 years, right? That's 400 years. So consider it, right? And consider also the fact that, as we were saying before, the Holy Roman Empire took a while before taking off properly, in at least in competitive terms with the other empires. So it's like 400 years, but 400 years of actual, it would extend given the prestige of the empire. Also consider there were other players in the area, right? For the West, it was very important to have a caliphate of Cordoba, for example, that could threaten certain areas of Gaul, and in the Mediterranean. So, here you have yet another player, right? And there would be so much to say, even just in terms of imperial models of imitation and so on, because even the caliphate at some point was imitated, and even the imperial models were extended. If you think about the Castilians at some point, say they would rule on the Christians and the Muslims alike, right? And as emperors, there's an Iberian imperial authority that is also probably one of the single most overlooked things within the same Western history. That here I also came to, I was acquainted with it also fairly recently, and I didn't, I knew about some of it, but I didn't understand it, the magnitude of it. But that's also an interesting indicator of a legacy that was shared. So the centrality of the world, that's something we have forgotten, right? We started forgetting from those times, and that's why it's crucial to really acknowledge it. That's also one of the most difficult things to realize today. How do you teach a kid born in the third millennium what it means, what a universal empire is? What kind of model, what kind of term of comparison could you use? I mean, it's difficult even for us, right? So, and it's impossible at a certain point, but it's truly that which makes the difference of us to try to make an effort to understand, right? Otherwise, what would the role of history, if not challenging us to know more, to say more? Well, I don't know whether to hand it here or not, because this could be expanded profitably at so many levels, but I understand that maybe for now it was just a note, an additional note to other things I said, maybe a bit less radical one than the usual. It's enough, and I kind of lost the charge now. But I was glad to address certain specific topics. I mean, the fact, especially of the Slavic Orthodox reality, was first of all underdocumented, then invested by the Ottomans, the Mongols, at some levels, and the rest being incorporated, the last of Slavic world being incorporated mostly into the Western Church. But even in there was an important, intense dialogue, right? And we will try to expand this better. And there were other imperial. Think about the Bulgarian Empire, right? That was an imposing thing. It kind of came to parallel the one of Constantinople at some point, but at the same time where also the Carolingians were there. So those are not things you can ignore. Just in terms of, we were talking about the Balkans before. Well, that's another reality on its own. We do not talk much about Balkan history, and yet it's been so important it keeps being so important for us. That's why I hope we will expand on that. But for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.